So I'm excited to be out here. This is my second time back in Poland. First time out in Poland, I came here for 3 weeks to work with CD Projekt Red on some Gwent UI stuff for some, I helped them with some UX and did some iterations with some of the card art and the card bordering and stuff like that. So you'll probably see why as I start flipping through some of my work. I have a particular style that actually the industry really enjoys, which is, the thing about UI is typically the difference between UI and something like all the art you're seeing at the conference, concept art, is UI has to be kind of almost overly polished at times, overly rendered. Unless you're going for a particular style, I would say that it's not good usually to keep the painting loose and the rendering loose. So let me give you a little brief about the company that I'm at right now. So I founded a company called Beholder. I'm a creative director there. Basically, Beholder is a UI UX studio, dedicated to high quality interfaces for AAA games. I co-founded that company to help basically other game companies with their UI needs. After seeing, that basically there was a lot of companies that were having a hard time filling UI. So if any of you out there are actually interested in moving into UI, there's good news. A lot of companies are at a shortage of UI people and really looking for good quality talent and people who really understand how usability works in design and how that works in with art. Another interesting thing about Beholder is we're a fully distributed studio. We don't have offices. We actually, my business partner lives in Texas. I work out of my home in California. When we need to hire on other people, we hire on freelancers or people moonlighting at their jobs. Those jobs and those locations could be anywhere from, we've had people from Europe, from Asia, all over the United States. Sometimes time zones can be a little challenging with doing meetups and reviews, but we tend to manage. I also spend a large portion of my time exploring emerging technologies. Right now, I'm really into doing VR art modeling. I don't know if you guys have gotten a chance to look at it, play with it, or even do VR. It's some really exciting stuff. And like I said, I'm about 3 weeks into it, and I probably spend about 4 or 5 hours a day in it, a little too much, but it's really cool stuff. I've worked exclusively in the games industry for about 10 years now. Some of the companies that I work with, or I've worked for, Blizzard, Epic Games, Oculus, GSN, CD Projekt Red, Wargaming, Kabam, others. I spent the majority of my time in the games industry at Blizzard Entertainment. I spent 7 years there. While I was there, I shipped StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty, Diablo 3. I was on the initial launch team for that. I shipped Heart of the Swarm, and the last game I shipped there was Heroes of the Storm. So before I began actually working in the games industry, I worked in advertising. This was the company that I worked for at. It was Leo Burnett. It's an ad agency out of Chicago. There I did interactive marketing. For those of you who don't know, basically I did Flash websites, and earlier in my career I did banner ads and things like that. So basically all the crap you guys actively try to ignore online, I did a lot of that. So it was doing work basically trying to get you guys to not actively ignore it, which was a really hard job to do because as we all know, content has to feel genuine for people to want to engage with it. I think games actually has this easy. You want to play the game, you download it, you purchase it, you play it. It's pretty easy. Advertising was never that easy. You have to try to engage someone, get them to go there, and then if anyone smells that it's part of a product or a launch of something else, they're like, I don't really care about it. So it was a huge challenge. It was a lot of fun, but also if any of you have friends or yourself have ever worked in an advertising agency, it's also can be kind of brutal. The hours are hard, and the content that you're putting out in the end is sometimes can feel very rushed. So I just want to take you through some of my work. I'm going to just kind of go through screen by screen, tell you kind of what phase in the project it is. I traditionally work in everything from conceptualization of the idea, so that's wireframing, prototyping, work with system designers. I do system design myself, but I'm going to focus most of what I'm showing you all on art because it's an art festival, and I did start basically doing art, and I ended up actually going backwards and doing a lot more design. So I'm doing a lot more design nowadays, but I still love doing art, so I'm going to take you through some of this stuff. So starting off with some of the work that I did for Heroes of the Storm, this is the character select screen. Some of the other interior shots of the shop. So you go in there, those characters, you can turn them in 3D, showing off some of the features. You can hover over those, get tooltips. This was matchmaking so if any of you played Heroes of the Storm, you go in, you go do draft mode. It's basically the matchmaking screen for that. Home screen. So interesting story about the home screen for Heroes of the Storm. I don't know if any of you also play. Could I get a quick show of hands? Any of you guys play MOBAs? League of Legends, Heroes of the Storm, Paragon? Okay, good. Actually, about 30 of you do. We were originally going to make the front screen for Heroes of the Storm 2D art. Now, if any of you play League of Legends, you understand that they do gorgeous 2D art on the front splash screens of their games. We didn't have time in our budget to actually do 2D art, so we would have put a product out that would have been 2D art, and Blizzard art looks gorgeous, but the thing is, so does League of Legends art, and League of Legends art was killing it with custom music and animations, so it was actually quite a struggle to get the 3D artists to put in the actual 3D characters on the home screen, and because there was a couple reasons. One, the production time it takes to do custom animations and layouts and backdrops for each character that you release is actually pretty high. And two, when you create these characters for an isometric game, you squash their proportions really awkwardly. So like, you'll have a character like Arthas, and his legs will actually be 3/4 shorter than everything else, so he'll look a little dwarfy. And the artists really didn't want to show the characters in that way. They were like, if they did, they wanted them to be at a sort of downward 3/4 angle, but you can imagine that you come to this kind of screen, you kind of want a heroic shot. You want a worm's eye view. You want it selling the character. You want, in this case, Rexar, you want him to fling his axe around and roar and have the music come in, and you want it to feel a little epic. You're not only are you selling the game, you're selling the character and the mood and the ambiance of that new hero that's released. Here are some of the internal store screens. When we were doing the store, and for those of you who have played it, I don't have video of this, but when you roll over these characters, they do an animation when you roll over from the store. We actually wanted the store in Heroes of the Storm to feel like a toy box. So it was a big thing for us that what you were playing in the game was exactly what you were buying. And again, using League of Legends as an example, League of Legends, what you're getting is you're buying the hero and you're getting the splash art, but what you get in game is sometimes dramatically different than actually what you purchased in the store. So it was a real big point for us to actually make sure that these characters were the actual thing that you're playing in the game. And another inside shot of the shop. Here's just sort of a collage in game. We have the portraits in the corner, and then those have their health bars and their mana bars and their buffs and debuffs. And each one of these had their own custom art made for their special abilities. So it's just kind of showing that off. Here, this is the draft screen again. I think it's important to show this. This is actually pulled from our documentation page. So sometimes when you're putting together art for a screen, you're putting together all the states, you got to make sure you document it for not only the designers, but the engineers. So this actually, just to take you guys through it, this has all the possible states that someone can hit when they're on the draft screen. And we got to make sure that these are all documented so that engineers know what to put in. Not only are there descriptions of each state that's underneath it, we actually had the triggers in game for the engineers. So a lot of the times when I'm doing art for a screen, or I'm going through and I'm trying to describe to the rest of the team how this stuff is built, this is the best way to do it. Because I can also take this stuff and animate it, but this is just way quicker. I can nail this stuff out in Photoshop, show all the states, hit them, and we can have a discussion. We can bring an engineer, we can bring a designer, bring a UI person into a room, and we can really flesh it out and talk about how we want to tackle it. Big part of what I do too is just straight up illustration. The thing about UI is that most pieces that you do in UI have to have actual functionality with them as well. So this one is actually, these are the Hero League icons. So as you gain up in rank, every 10 spots, these actually increase in art. So, you know, when you rank up from, let's say, 39 to 40, And I actually think that these numbers are in reverse. Yep, they are. That's cool. But it's supposed to be the other way around. So when you rank up, they're supposed to visually feel better. You have a fanfare animation on the score screen. It feels good. The 3D character on the score screen does an animation. And you want to give any moment that you can, give a reward to the player for feeling like they've achieved something. So here's just sort of a view of kind of like what that progression looks like as it goes up. Same thing, we had Hero Leagues and Team Leagues. The game actually has changed their design at this point, but Team League was a whole separate league from Hero League. And then if you reach Grandmaster League, you got the whole like super crowned out. It's really difficult sometimes you'll have designers come to you. We didn't have a Grandmaster League, and just something to show here real quick. You think that the rank 1 is what you're building for, and then you've got to do this thing where you basically Voltron it out, or you add even more stuff to it. It's actually kind of ridiculous, the amount of like filigree. You just keep kind of tacking things onto it. Sometimes you can go ahead and you can tack on like a different shader or a different animation to it to make it better, but sometimes you have to just physically keep making it larger. It's kind of a challenge. It's actually quite annoying, usually when it happens at the end of a project. I thought it was interesting to show this. So this was the original mood board for Heroes of the Storm. If any of you know, there's a pretty awesomely eccentric art director named Samwise Didier at Blizzard Entertainment, and he came to me and he goes, look, I don't actually have time to develop what the Nexus looks like. And for those who don't know, in Heroes of the Storm, the Nexus is the world in which all the Blizzard Entertainment IPs live in. So you've got Diablo, which is concrete and chains and very gothic, and then you've got World of Warcraft, which is high fantasy and really bubbly, and you've got StarCraft, which is obviously kind of worn metals and sort of Warhammery space metal sort of stuff, or Zerg if you kind of want to go there, Zerg and Protoss. So how do all these different art directions live into something? So to get him to approve on something, I basically did something that I knew he would like. I kind of went with a style called synthwave. So at the time, synthwave wasn't really a big style. Now you can kind of see it everywhere. It's you can even see it now in movies coming out, Blade Runner. There's quite a bit of art online that has these really, really awesome magenta and cyan and green tones coming into it. So anytime before we start a project, we like to throw together a quick mood board of stuff to kind of get the gist of what we're trying to aim at. Obviously, this is grids, a little bit of noise and distortion. We're talking about glows, really high contrast, and because we knew early on that these characters are going to be colorful and bold and have large silhouettes. So if we were going to build a UI and a world for them to live in, it can't be really subtle. It has to actually kind of build up to the level that those characters were going to be and had to feel like they could live in that world. Also, just picking out fonts and color sets. This is something that we kind of go through a little bit of a process back and forth. We'll look at fonts, we'll put them in the game, we'll put them in engine, we'll throw them in mock-ups, we'll kind of see kind of where those net out and what they look like. This is changing gears. This is actually some work I recently did for the game Paragon. So Epic Games came to us and said, look, we don't have enough time to finish out some of our design systems, and we really don't like the look of how our level system works and how some of our portraits look. They aren't really conveying when someone's at a specific rank. We want it to match the current style we have. So sometimes I'm hired to do something very surgical. Heroes of the Storm is a good example of, we don't know where we're starting with. We do have these other Blizzard IPs, and we need to build it into one look and feel. But this one is much more, we have a look and feel. We need it to look a little bit better, but we also can't touch these 7 systems. But we need you to come in, redesign this one thing, and make sure it all works, and then we put a new art style in, fits with the old one, new one still works with it, and the design doesn't touch these 5 systems because the engineers don't have time to fix it. So these are some of the portrait borders that I did for it. Some of the initial first-time user experience stuff, unlocking your initial hero mastery portraits. Some of the stuff isn't the most fun stuff, but tooltips, I actually enjoy doing things like this because displaying information in kind of a way that feels clean and sexy is something I really enjoy doing. It's a different type of design. Quick screenshots of some of those rewarding moments. So this is when you've unlocked a new level of mastery. In this case, you would be moving from 5 to level 6. Moving on to Diablo. So how many people recognize this backdrop? Cool. So I got to actually do all the map paintings for the initial backgrounds for Diablo. They're actually still in there. And a lot of that was, to be honest, kit bashing a lot of what cinematics had. So you can actually see the moon in the background, and these were all from the initial cinematics, and they were just photoshopped beyond all hell. This stuff was all painted in the front. The tree was pulled from a piece of concept art, and then I basically will go in and I'll make sure that all the values match, because you're pulling stuff from different sources, right? Concept art, cinematics. Cinematics has a whole different level of polish to it, especially Blizzard cinematics are pixel perfect. Concept art is usually loose, so you got to go in and actually remove the loose parts of the concept art, put it in. That was Act 1, this is Act 2. So again, these were pulled from concept art. It's also important to note that if you're doing an actual matte painting of these for like a movie, this composition wouldn't look this way. They looked this way specifically because they had to have UI everywhere. They actually had to house 4 players on the front, because when you party in, all 4 players had to stand there. So this is one of those things where, as its own, standing on its own, it's actually not the best composition. I would never do a composition like this if I was just doing a piece of art. This actually, the whole left-hand side of the screen, whole right-hand side, and all the middle had to actually house characters and UI. So when you get them all in there, it actually looks much better. Here we have Act 3. Some of these things were done with some great artists I worked with at Blizzard. One of them is named Nate Bowden. Nate Bowden currently works on the Overwatch team. And P. Cooper, who I believe is now at Riot Games. P. Cooper is another fantastic artist. They kind of helped work with me back and forth, source things. We kind of threw the Photoshop file back and forth. And then we actually figured out how to separate all of these into separate planes, because when you go to change your character, you click on it, the camera has to zoom in a little bit. So we had to actually find a way to kind of pseudo 2.5D all these backgrounds once they were painted. Funny story about this. This seems really boring. The reason that I put this in here from Diablo is this is the most famous piece of art I've ever done. And I'll tell you why. Anyone who downloaded Diablo and played it on day 1 got the Error 37 screen. That's that art. And it's kind of funny. It was a joke when I saw it on Kotaku in the morning. I was like, oh, okay, that's the most famous piece of art I've ever done. And it's a box with a button in it, and everyone, it wasn't a very positive thing. It wasn't famous for good reasons. Everyone was pretty angry about server issues. But the other thing that this helps illustrate is that when we go ahead and we do, there's a lot of unfun things that you have to do in UI as well. I still find these personally really interesting, but you got to go in, you got to make dialog boxes, and you got to make large, medium, and small ones. You got to make sure it fits 1 button and 2 button layouts, and you give this to an engineer and a designer, and you look at it, and you prove it, and you make sure that these things all work and they're all consistent, and they all have the same value tones as the rest of the UI. So it's kind of a little bit boring, and it seems a little bit simple, but this kind of stuff is absolutely necessary if you're going to be polishing up a game and making sure everything feels very consistent throughout. Here were some banners that I did for difficulty. Obviously, as you progress through Diablo, go from normal, nightmare, hell to inferno. The skulls were actually done by art director Christian Leitner. I just took his skulls, color matched them, did a couple other little painting variations, and then put some banner work behind it. It's important to note that in UI, and when I'm showing you guys a lot of this stuff, I try calling out the other artists that worked on it. UI, it typically is never just all me doing something, or never just the UI artist doing something solely. You're usually pulling concept art in from someone else who did it, from another artist, or other pieces from the design that someone will make specifically for this. In this case, these skulls were just in a library of files that I pulled for difficulty. I'm going to take you through sort of just a little bit of a process through how we got to the quest icons. Now, like these were basically used as little jewels and gems every time. Like in the game, when you got the quest, this came up with the quest dialog box. In the screens that we called the glue screens, I still to this day don't know why they're called glue screens, but all the screens that are when you're not in the game and outside of it, some people think of it as BattleNet. These are the quest icons. So basically, I started off by painting one of them, right? This is what it looks like when it's locked. This is what it looks like when it's unlocked. We decided that each act should have its own color of stained glass behind it to denote the act. And it would be really cool if we just gave it a different kind of texture above it. So that's how it looks in its first iteration. This is how it looks across a couple different acts, and when you start kind of blowing it out for each quest that you get in the acts. Here's what it looks like when we take those and we produce all those icons and we start bringing it back into UI and we start kind of putting it, we're like, okay, what kind of filigree do we want around it? What does it look like with some of the text that we have? When you're doing a game that's as large as games that you do at Blizzard, they have to be localized. I believe we localized them for over 27 countries. So Blizzard games were localized. There was always a motto at Blizzard to make think globally. All the games had to work, and they always said something, make sure the game feels like it was made in that country. So we didn't ever want the games to feel like they were made in the US and then they were ported out to a bunch of other countries. We always wanted to make sure that when the game hit shores in other countries, that it felt like it could have been made in any one of those countries. It didn't feel like it was a second-rate citizen. It was a huge thing. So you really had to work to get the most out of your font sets, because typically the font, you'd have to get a font that could work globally and look good. So you wouldn't get things like gradients on fonts. You could get things like glows every now and then if you're lucky, if the engine supported it. Another thing that's important to note, that each game team at Blizzard runs its own independent engine. So I worked on almost every engine and every game team when I was at Blizzard, and they all had completely different ways of going about doing typography and fonts and glows and gradients, and they all had different features, and some of them had more and some of them had less. Diablo, I think, just had glows. So to analyze and break this apart, the glow that's behind it is just an orb that's squished, because that's how we could get a glow behind it. And the glow that's around it is actually an outline that's faded. We doubled up the font, made it thicker dynamically with outline, and faded it back just enough so it feels like a glow. Sometimes you got to do some really stupid things just to make something look like it's glowing. And here it is in kind of its final form, whereas in Diablo it sits on top, and then you've got your kind of buttons that are on the left, and kind of this is what it looked like for each act. This screen is another kind of example of that other one that I showed you. Like when you hand this off to engineers and you're talking to designers and they're talking about all the states. I mean, when you're playing around, you're adding a friend in a game. You don't think about all the states that are there for adding a friend. And this isn't even all of them. This isn't the hover and the press states that go in. Those are actually in a separate document. So these are just all the states that can happen, and then all the permutations that can happen off of that are even greater. I think you guys have all played games where they don't think about these states and they don't do that, and it's just sort of like, you're like, I'm not really sure that when I'm rolling over something, if that, okay, is it doing that thing? I guess I'll click it, okay, it does that thing. Or it doesn't do that thing, or is an expected behavior. There's a part on the page that's clickable, and there's a part that looks just like it next to it that's not clickable, and you don't understand why. It's really important to do this so that you kind of, you can have a conversation with the whole team around what usability you want with these really, really, really intense screens. Usually friends lists and social systems and achievement systems have the most dense UI in them. So it definitely takes a little bit of time to put together a screen like this, probably a couple weeks. Another thing that's kind of funny, right up here, I don't know if you see Mr. Decker Kane in the empty friends list state. It says you have no friends. That actually shipped in the game, and it wasn't supposed to. It's really like depressing to go to the screen and have Decker Kane being like, you have no friends. It's like, oh, thanks. They were supposed to replace that with something that felt just a little kinder than that, but so word of the wise. Sometimes when you place these strings in there, you do it to just in a joking way. They'll go all the way through to the ship game sometimes. It's kind of funny. Here's just more of these types of screens. This is for when you're picking the different classes. This is a game that when I worked at a company after I left Blizzard for a little while, I did a little foray in mobile games. It was a gaming platform where you could bet real money against other players to play games. The platform was called StarCraft. It's actually kind of a cool look and feel to it. I was in charge at that company of all the user experience and all the creative and art direction that went into the project. Here's just some of kind of what these screens look like. We did have real IPs on them too, which was interesting. It was actually one of the best mobile Pac-Man games I ever played. It's not even available anymore to download, but you had Solitaire, Tetris, we had Two Dots. They were really fun games to play. Here's some more iconography and of course some more filigree. These should look familiar. Sometimes from some of my old stuff, you have literally 4 hours to put something together. So sometimes you just pull an old PSD and you alter it a little bit and it does the trick. Here are just some sort of process shots. So before I started going into my work, I told you guys I do a lot of wireframing and process stuff. I'm not going to show you that stuff. This is just to kind of show you kind of what some of that stuff looks like. How some of the functionality looks like, what the scroll states look like. Most of the time, I do this for almost every product that I work on. Even if the client doesn't ask for it, I'll go in and I'll create wireframes or sometimes even clickable prototypes just to test out and understand how the functionality works. And then it helps me better understand how to lay out the page and do the art. And I also did the website kind of layout for that as well. It was. We actually, sometimes this happens when you're in production. I don't do website design anymore. I used to do website design all the time. Our production company was putting something together and it just wasn't looking right, wasn't coming together, so I had to step in and actually help creative direct the website. One thing I also do quite a bit of, when I worked in advertising, I did a lot of Fortune 100 branding for a lot of companies as well. Those companies with ESPN, which is a sports channel in the States, Walgreens, which is a pharmacy out there, Nintendo of America. Branding is an interesting thing because it's spending weeks on a piece of art that's this big and very graphic design heavy. So this was a game for VR called Dead and Buried. I was commissioned by Oculus and Facebook to do it. I'm going to take you guys through some of sort of the comps and some of the ideas that sort of the black and whites, flats. So I tried a couple different things. This was a game that was kind of, it's a VR game where you're in a Western sort of setting, very colorful, where you're cowboys versus basically zombie ghosts. And it had a very colorful, very sort of Western feel. So we got one of these that feels a little bit more kind of splattery, right? You know, one of these that feels a little more Western, a little American Western, has that kind of feel to it. And here was just sort of, this was one that actually, this is pretty close to what they ended up picking. Ended up like squared off, boxy, sort of pulling the lines in different spots. This one was kind of just like a straight up clean font with some kind of like fake wood lines through it. This one was one that had some bullet holes on the top, and the buried kind of had some sort of like ground, dirt, and gravel kind of coming off of it. It's also important to know that these are not meant to be final. They're meant to be quick and get look and feel. So you know, the kerning, the placement, they're laid down pretty quickly. I'll probably do 5 of these in probably 4 or 5 hours. Sit down and do them, and then everything else in the process, which is usually 1 to 2 weeks, gets you to this point where you're doing color feel, you're kind of illustrating, you're getting to a point. So this is the final logo that shipped for the game, and then shipped on the back of the Oculus Touch boxes as well. So I also worked on StarCraft. StarCraft was the first series I worked on when I got to Blizzard. And here's just sort of a showing of like a hollow panel. What we call it the hollow panel. It's basically just saying when you're waiting for a match to hit. Some of the this was a good screen because it had some of the icons that I did. It had the kind of button look and feel that I did for StarCraft. This is obviously the profile, summary of kind of everything you're doing. Here are some states of when you're basically waiting for in a lobby to find a match for StarCraft. Here's some of this was for Heart of the Swarm. Here's for some of the internal screens. So again, I didn't do the art of the 3D character. I didn't do obviously the concept art that's in the background, but it obviously without it, if I were to remove those, it would just look like a bunch of fonts on page. And believe it or not, as simple as this stuff is, it takes way longer than you think. Like these screens go through iteration after iteration after iteration. And if any of you know Blizzard games, they spend a lot of time on iteration. They go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. League icons. So anyone who plays StarCraft is probably familiar with these. I was usually in this column here. I think once I got into this column, and then back to this column. Any of you who were good enough in the room to get past that gold marker, congratulations, you are amazing. And just some more screens from Heart of the Swarm. All right, so I'm going to go into what is user interface. Now, I don't know the level of knowledge in this room, so I'm going to keep it fairly broad, but I kind of want to talk about what I think user interface is. So it'll kind of kill two birds with one stone. If some of you in the room are not really familiar with the process of user interface, it'll kind of help guide us there. And if you are familiar with it, it'll at least give you an idea of what the philosophy is that I think behind UI. So UI acronyms. Okay, so this is one of those things that I don't know if you guys have seen all these acronyms online. I sometimes swear there's more acronyms for UI than there are people in the UI industry. These are all actually real. And some of them flow everything from data science all the way up to someone who just does UI art. Mostly in games, the ones that really matter are user interface and user experience. Some of these are permutations of those other ones: user interface design, user experience design, content experience management, experience design, user-centered design, information architecture. I don't even remember what CX stands for. I just pulled it off of a page. But basically, there's generally different combinations of these words that usually mean user, interface, architecture, experience, customer, product, information. So what do all these acronyms mean? Because if I stay too long on the screen, I swear I'm going to lose you. It means a person puts shit on the screen so a player knows how to interact with the game. That's basically what UI is. If the UI person isn't doing their job and this shuts down and this communication is bad, the player does not know how to reach its audience. And basically, the work that the gameplay design team did, it basically falls to the floor. I've seen it happen a couple times. You usually test it out in playtesting, but sometimes I've seen products go out, and even ones that I've worked on, falter and have those problems. So basically, what do these people do? So what's really great about UI is now we have formal UI roles within game teams. These are basically individuals who are 100% dedicated to UI-related tasks. Most of the time, they have a company-accepted career path, as in there's a junior, mid-level, senior, and sometimes lead state, depending on the size of the game team and the company. We're now finally hitting a stage where schools have formal UI programs. This is something that wasn't there when I first started in the industry. So let me just take you through kind of what the main roles are. So UI artist. Basically, they're the most commonly known position in a modern day game studio. Most of the time, if they're hiring for one role, they're hiring for a UI artist. Some of those main roles include UI-specific art tasks like HUDs and buttons, like a lot of the stuff that I just showed you. Implementation of those UI textures into the game engine, if they're more technical based, and then working with the art director to match the style and tone of the UI. So what really makes a good UI artist or a great designer? A UI can be a combination of basically graphic designers, people into typography, animation, design, psychology is a big part of it, video editing, sound design. If any of you in the room are actually looking to transition into UI career or are simply interested in it, it's really good to basically become proficient in a couple of these different disciplines if you're going to move forward. Because it's really about conveying your ideas, and if you can't convey your ideas, like basically if you can't take something and chop it up, put some sound to it in a video editing thing and show it to someone, sometimes that idea will it'll just be cut, and your idea would actually sometimes help improve the game and the overall gameplay experience. Another main role you guys probably know of is a UI or UX designer. So this role is sometimes embedded within the UI team or sometimes embedded within the game design team. It really depends on the composition of the game team. Their involvement can range from taking on specific systems that have heavy UI elements, for example, tutorial systems, so getting the player into the game. Social systems, adding friends, party management, so how do we get together and have voice chat and get together and play a game in the game. Sometimes those are player ranking systems. Those are extremely complex systems to work on. If any of you have played a ranking system that either feels off or doesn't feel quite right, excuse me. Leaderboard systems, so basically any kind of system that tells players this is where your global rank is or your local rank is or rank against your friends, and core player engagement loops. So by that I mean, if any of you have played a free-to-play game on your phone, you've seen a core engagement loop. It's keeping you in the washing machine of a game so that you can eventually spend 99 cents and then hopefully a lot more to stay engaged in the game. Also, it's important to note that the UI designer or UX designer works with the game director and sometimes the UI lead to outline user behavior through mock-ups, through flows. They usually guide gameplay testing. And sometimes this person will actually do the art as well. It just depends on, again, the size of the studio. So how was UI done in the past? The example I'm about to give is a little bit of a characterization, but I think it kind of gets the point across. So step number one, first make the whole game. This is not how games are done nowadays, but you basically get the design, the engineering, and the art for the game nearly to a complete state. Then you basically just reserve the whole bottom third of the screen to fill up a bunch of functionality in UI. I'm sure you guys, any of you played older games, you see that, right? A lot of RTS games, a lot of, I'm trying to think of like the original StarCrafts, you have Civ. A lot of those games will just have the whole bottom third of the screen taken up. Even including, I believe the original Diablo and Diablo 2 had basically just a big chunk on the bottom that was art and a bunch of UI thrown into it. And the third step is you don't have a UI artist, so you put anybody on it. So, and that person was usually an artist that was like, finished their job first and was like, oh, fuck. They're like, yeah, get over here, Brian, we're gonna put you on this and you're gonna be doing the UI. So it's not that it was a lack of caring, it's just, to be totally honest, there wasn't a lot of time to do a lot of this stuff. The game teams used to be a lot smaller. So a couple other reasons. In addition, we didn't have engines and software that sped up development. Like I said, game team size was a big thing, but we also didn't have engines that had UI toolkits in for people to actually build UI. You would have to build the art, cut it up, put it together in some sort of XML layout, and have an engineer do it. So anytime you wanted to change something, you have to go to an engineer, they'd have to change it, and then they have to go back and do art and back and forth. So obviously in small teams, yes?
Did you work in that system?
StarCraft had an XML-based system, but I actually was fortunate enough to come in kind of after this. I was kind of in a transition phase. I came in to Blizzard in 2008, and by that time they were starting to build in UI systems to actually finish this stuff. They were also starting to build out UI teams. That's one reason I got hired. They actually started getting dedicated designers and artists, but there were a couple instances where it was done absolutely the same way, especially since StarCraft 2 was the game that I worked on. And as you noticed, StarCraft 2 did have a bottom third all taken up with UI, so I was in that transition. You know, another thing too, the market has changed. We now have free-to-play models and games as a service. And for those of you who don't know what games as a service it is, it's basically any game where they continue to put content in it and they hope that you keep playing it. So this is a game when they build it from the beginning, they go, this is a 10-year cycle. Most Blizzard games have that. World of Warcraft, obviously, it's an MMO. They want people to play it a long time. But even games like StarCraft and Diablo, they're still patching Diablo. In fact, when I was there, they were still doing patches for Warcraft 3. And that game came out 10 years prior to when I was working there. So, you know, games as a service is more of something nowadays, so that add content to it, and of course get more money for development and keep making more content moving forward. Another thing, immersive UI wasn't really something that it was just too technically difficult to do, and I'm about to go into what immersive UI is and what makes good immersive UI, because that's something that has actually come forth in probably the last 6 to 7 years. So bringing us up to kind of present day, what makes great UI? You know, all teams are unique in the way that they are structured. So many examples and suggestions make the assumption that, you know, or I should say, sorry, the examples I'm about to give make the suggestions below that you are currently in development on a game. You have a team that includes one or more UI UX designers or artists. You have dedicated UI engineering. You have creative or art direction that is solidified around the UI. And so basically I'm saying you have a project already going. So those are the assumptions I'm making going forward for present day UI, which most of the time is the case, something that wasn't so much in the past. So based on that, I'm going to take you through some of the list of factors that I believe make for a pretty successful UI. So I brought up immersion. Immersion and integration are huge. I'm going to take you through 4 terms here that basically describe immersion. Non-diegetic, which is the least immersive. You have meta. You have spatial UI. And you finally have diegetic UI, which is the most immersive. So you're probably like, I don't know what some of these things mean or how they relate to UI. So this grid actually does a really good job of describing exactly what I was just talking about in the last slide. So 2 factors to think about. Does it exist in the fictional game world? And is it visualized in the 3D space? So a good example of non-diegetic UI, that's mostly what you guys are familiar with. It's a HUD on top of the game space. Spatial UI is basically UI elements presented in the game's 3D space with or without being an entity of the actual game world. So this is, I use Fallout 4 as an example here. This is, you're looking at something, it highlights. Left 4 Dead is another good example when you're looking at teammates that can outline. That's something that isn't exactly seen to the other players in the game world, but are seen to the player and are actually in the spatial space. Meta UI can exist in the game world, but it isn't exactly visualized spatially for the player. So here, the best example are blood splatters on a screen. When you're in like a game like Call of Duty, blood splatters they exist in real life, and it's something you see, but it's not actually visualized inside of the game world. And then finally, it's kind of the holy grail of immersion, which is diegetic. I use Dead Space as a great example because anything diegetic is an interface that is included in the game world and can be seen in the game world. So in this case, the character in Dead Space, his name is Isaac. He can see the map in the game world, and so can you. So I'm going to use Dead Space as an example. I know, like, for those who follow UI, this is sort of the example that's been kind of used many, many times before, but I think it's just almost a perfect example of great immersive diegetic UI. So I'm going to do a brief breakdown of how diegetic design philosophy works in Dead Space. So for A, we see Isaac's health on his back. This bar that's going down his back represents his health. You see that little half crescent shape that's coming down the side of him? That represents his Isaac's shield. And then what was really great about this game is they didn't. They completely pulled your ammo counter off this game and put it right on the gun. So they kind of used this thing where it was like a holographic display on the gun that showed your ammo count. It was large enough for the player to see, and I believe, and I can't remember right now, I believe it flashed a different color when it was low or had no ammo in it. So I want you to also notice the angle at which all of this is shown. So this is where the challenges come in, right? So UI has to work really close with game design to get this to work, because at any given time, you don't want this information to go away. Isaac turns his body too much, you don't see your health, you don't see your shield, you don't see your ammo. The last thing you want to do when a player has to make a split decision about is their health low, are they low on ammo, what's the next move they're going to do, is suddenly hide it all. It'd be like suddenly if you were in a game and your HUD just disappeared when you needed it the most. So this is you can see, you start to see why this is probably not an easy thing always to do in a game. It's also important to note that for this to be pulled off, every department usually has to be aligned with the goal of immersion from the get-go. It could end up being less usable for the player and involve a lot more effort to correct later on. So you really got to know you're doing this from the get-go. So if Dead Space does this, why doesn't every game that's trying to do it? Might not match what you're trying to do with the game design. I have an RTS game. It doesn't really make much sense that I've got characters that are maybe 20 pixels on the screen, have all their UI built into them. It's probably a worse game design, and the game isn't going to be better off for it. So while immersive game design for most games makes for a better game, immersive UI design, it doesn't match every intended game design. Not every game has design pillars. So it's really important for a game to have design pillars. And by that I mean, from the get-go, when you're first starting to kind of pull a game out of the primordial ooze, it's really important to know what you want to go for. Our game has to be fast and fun, quick in and out sessions. We want the player to feel X, Y, and Z playing through the game. It's really important that if immersion is one of those, to lean on that and basically, like I just said in the previous example, talk about it up front. It's hard. It's really, really hard to remove UI. Not only is it hard from a technical standpoint, it's hard to convince people and engineers why you should just, hey man, I've totally seen UI in games many, many times. It's just a health bar there. Why would I do anything other? I've been told that phrase many, many times by designers and engineers. Why would I try to do it differently? So how can you achieve some of this stuff in a game? All right, so integration makes immersion possible. This is really important. You have to first stop thinking of your UI and your UI team as a separate discipline. This is a big problem. It's called throw it over the wall. A game designer will do something, they only care about what's in their game design space, and they won't involve the UI designer in it. You have to integrate them into traditional pipelines as artists and designers. Not everyone is going to agree with me on that. I think it's much better. I think it's better to call them a designer, integrate them with the design team. I think it's better to take a UI artist, integrate them with our team. I think it makes for a better product in the end. And I think your game, especially if you're going for immersion, I think in the end it ends up just being better in saving time. Start early. So try to avoid key aspects of the UI coming in late in the project. You can really run into issues by not laying out a solid approach to your UI. Senior UI talent should be brought in early. This is your lead or your senior two. Brought in early with the game director and the art director so they can be an extension of the story that you're trying to tell. Remember, the UI is not there to alter how the game is played or what the characters' environments look like. The UI is there to enhance the underlying DNA and promote consistency across the product. Again, it's made to promote consistency across the whole product. It's not there to change the core fundamental principles of game design. Most of the time, it's really good to remind them that UI people come in peace. We're not trying to change what you're doing. I think there's a big wall that usually can be built up by design and by art departments when they feel like their art or their design is being threatened by something that's an outside force. Integration creates camaraderie. Camaraderie is a really important thing on a game team. You've got to make sure, again, everyone's on the same page. It allows for sharing of ideas more freely. It creates a genuine collaborative work environment. I believe that if you don't create that work environment is dictated by management so that they can ship the product out at the end. It's always good to get ahead of that. Also, it's good to think of integration as a philosophy. Integration can mean being within physical proximity of each other, but it's more important as a philosophy. There has to be buy-in from the team to do this in the first place. Obtaining immersion by just having UI team push it will produce half results. So if it's just the UI team that wants immersion, it's probably not the right direction to go. That has to come from the rest of the game team. So I'm going to go into a little bit of philosophy and approach. So big assumption that's made is that easy to use UI is easy to create. I think anyone who's in this room who's attempted to use UI or has been brought in on a team to do it knows that UI is actually deceptively difficult. I say that because I think when most people think of UI, and I understand it's not the sexiest thing in the end, but if they think about UI, they're like, oh, there's a couple buttons in the upper left, there's a couple buttons in the bottom right, and we just put the stuff over on this side of the screen, and it's fine. The truth is, it's usually never that easy. I think it's important to note that sometimes it actually can be. Most of the time, really well done UI comes in at the cost of iteration, experience, and hard work. The importance of failing. Failing early and failing often. If you have a culture that doesn't promote failure, you have to nail it. We call it silver bullet design. You got one bullet in the gun in the chamber and you shoot it and that's it. Sometimes you have to do that. It's usually really uncomfortable when you have to. You've got to really attempt out of the box ideas. Game design teams actually get the luxury of usually doing this early on, so it makes sense that the UI can actually piggyback onto that. You have to test, fail, and correct those mistakes until the game is ready for the players. It's also important to be dirty, not only with your designs, so it should be throwaway. It's known as throwaway. The code should also be dirty. Yes?
Yeah, the question, how do you test all the iterations? Because there are many iterations, how do you test them?
So the best way to do it is you can do it in circles. Your first circle are the people that are just around you. So if you're actually on a UI team, ask those people. Test it, work with them. Next step, go to the game team. Ask people who have free time to do it to jump in and offer feedback. If you have the budget and the time for it, it's great to do blind user testing. I'm totally spoiled. I probably worked at one of the only companies in the gaming industry where you can do UI, do a PTR server, so a playtest realm, put it up, and watch people on Twitch play it. And they don't give a fuck. They will literally walk over to that product and go, this sucks. They don't even know they're being watched by people at Blizzard at that moment. It's actually really fantastic. People think that they go on Twitch, they stream games. We're watching all of it. We're watching every little bit of it because those are the most genuine reactions to a game you can possibly get. You're not behind a two-way mirror, which happens in UI testing. Sometimes you'll do a test environment where you'll put a bunch of people playing it. You'll ask them a bunch of questions. You'll put them behind a two-way mirror as if they don't know that you're on the other side of it. And you're sitting there analyzing, oh, what did they do? Oh, okay. Well, what do you think about that? That's really good, and it does produce pretty great results. It'll at least get rid of the really bad problems, but nothing beats watching someone on Twitch play your product and just tear it to the ground. You're like, oh, you gotta start over. So yeah, start small, and if you're on a small game team, you guys just gotta fill in for each other as much as you possibly can. You're on a 3 to 4 person indie team, everyone's a UI artist at that moment. Everyone's a UI designer. You gotta jump in and help out. Of course, I just talked about creating a culture around acceptance of failure, attempting out-of-the-box ideas, and iterating dirty and quickly. I just didn't advance them. All right. Hiring knowledgeable senior-level talent. So if you can find them, hire them. They're really, really hard to find. This is another plea for anyone who wants to get into this industry. Do it. Like any other discipline, you got to put in the hours, you got to put in the years, you got to put in the hard work. But if you can make it to a senior level, there is actually a large market demand for it right now. Companies are having a really hard time finding knowledgeable people who have shipped games in a UI capacity. If you happen to have, and this is the case for a lot of smaller teams, and by smaller teams, just to give you context, I'm talking about under 20, maybe even under 30, somewhere in that range. If you only got one UI person and they aren't senior, just make sure they're knowledgeable and experienced as much as they can, and if you get them senior level, fantastic. Having someone who has experience will always save you time and money. So when there's a debate on a game team of whether they should hire someone more senior level because it isn't in the budget, it almost always ends up in the end saving you time and money. To have someone who has been through it and can tell you they can tell you the 20 things not to do before you do the 20 things you should do. This is an important lesson that I'm still always practicing. Stop talking, shut up, and listen. I'm actually going to pull up a quote from Jeff Kaplan. He is the game director for Overwatch, VP of design at Blizzard, and this is exactly what he said. I hate reading things that are directly on the screen, but I'm going to do it for this one. So as a designer, I hear ideas all the time. Every designer believes that every idea is either the perfect solution or the coolest idea. It's not until you have talked to engineers, talked to artists, sold your idea, gotten into the game, tested its effectiveness, locked down the timeline with producers, and shipped it in the product that you can claim a solution. Even then, you're judged by the players and audience that play it. It's an important thing to learn because, especially for younger designers, and if you have an idea, stay excited about it. But the road ahead to getting that idea shipped in the game, if you're on a larger game team, takes time. It takes diligence. You have to make sure it's the right solution. You can't just pump it out there. And I think it's also important to note that if Jeff saw this phrase, he'd probably be like, I don't remember saying that. It's very paraphrased. But it's very close to what he told me because it's stuck in my head. So moving into the future of UI. We're at the beginning of a really interesting kind of adventure in UI with new gaming hardware that doesn't simply just boast graphics and fidelity or online capabilities of the games, but changes the way that we interact with them. So where are we headed with some of these? Where are we headed with UI and some of this emerging hardware? VR, AR, and MR. Now I know this is like the total trendy hot shit thing right now is virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality. Should you care about it? Yeah. I don't know if any of you have tried 3D glasses for television. I think when we all put those on, we're like, this is a fad. This is something that's really actually, it was neat seeing things in 3D, but it just really, honest to God, it wasn't really that cool. I think we kind of knew that you had to buy these specialty glasses for it, which, by the way, VR and AR and all this stuff doesn't get away from. I think it's important to note, but the cool factor to it was it was like marginally better. I feel that it is clear that VR and MR isn't a fad. There's aspects of these technologies that will become a large player in the market in the near to midterm future. I actually personally believe this. The new way of interacting with games creates all new challenges for UI and design to overcome. I think one of the examples are the first time they realized they needed a lock to 90 frames per second for VR, otherwise someone would throw up, was probably a big discovery moment for that. I don't know if any of you have played VR games and have played it on a graphics card setting or something where the frame rate suddenly dropped to like 20 frames per second and you just went, oh my God, I gotta sit down for a second. Yeah, I'm sure that was a very scary thing when they were developing games in the beginning. Like, oh my God, is everyone just gonna get sick if we make games for this? Very scary thing. Some of the other questions that like you have right now with all this developing hardware. How about the first time somebody tried to type in VR? How do you bring up keyboard in VR? What are the best ways to do that? How about the first time someone to grab an object in 3D space? What's the best way to do that? I have a trigger. What are the best visual cues for me to do that? UI now has no chance but to be immersive. This is why I started this off with immersion. I think the future is going here, and I think immersion is going to become more and more of a hot topic as we move forward. How do you move around your location on a map? How do you move the player around? I think right now we're coming into our own on some solutions. You can teleport, you can move, there's freeform movement, there's keyed lock movement where you move a certain degrees around basically to make sure players don't get sick, or just to make sure that it makes the most sense when you you can turn only so much because you got a cord on your back, or sometimes you don't have room scale set up in VR, so you can't walk around the room and discover. All these discoveries, they're happening right now. And they create a wonderful opportunity and creative solutions for UI. So if you're looking for something new, UI, moving into this new world of MR, AR, and VR, is just a bright future of discovery. So if you're someone who likes to go, I like to be on ground floor or something, it's a perfect opportunity. I think it's also important to note that if you haven't played with any of these technologies yet, I highly encourage you to explore and play around with them. Watching a video of someone do VR, if you've looked at it and go, it's not really that cool, it's nothing like it. You really got to put a headset on to experience it, to pass judgment on it. So what are some of the challenges working with these emerging technologies? So the hardware is always evolving. I think for any of you who follow VR, you understand that Vive is now coming out with a new controller that allows you to open your hands and not have to have movement while you're doing that. Well, crap. Did that just create a whole new level? Everyone's just starting to figure out level A, where they have 2 triggers. Okay, I've got joysticks, I've got buttons, I've got triggers. These are like controllers that are snapped apart and over here, and I've got some motion movement. Well, now I can do things like, I don't have to have hand movement. What if I don't have to press any buttons at all? What if I can press buttons in these 3D spaces? What are the new problems and solutions that'll come out of this space? I think what's really, really cool, and this is something that I personally use, the new exciting workflows that are coming from VR. So the company I work for, we already do art reviews fully in VR. We use programs like Facebook Spaces and Big Screen. So if you guys have never used those before, they're really cool. They're actually free to download if you have either a HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift. They allow you to pull your computer screen up and then throw it to a movie screen. You can use pointers. You can completely work and manipulate around your computer, pull up different programs, turn and talk to each other, wave, give hand gestures, circle things. It's amazing. So when I work with people that are remote, we can jump into a room and we can have a conversation like we're sitting next to each other. It's really fantastic stuff. I do think the far future is just going to, this is where my brain just starts going to Fantasyland, right? I think it's going to be fascinating to see where UI goes after we find a way to control objects with just the thought of our mind. We're already seeing prototypes where people have headsets on where they can think things and move objects around the page just with thought. Another good question to ask is there even going to be UI in future games? Are we just going to be thinking the things and they're going to be happening? Are we just going to go into some sort of metaverse? Are we going to be able to implant things into the back of our head and travel there? These are important questions, I think, to ask yourself, because thinking about the future helps you bridge the gap if you're trying to do things that are for the now. And I also just think it's really exciting to be sitting on this sort of event horizon of the current boost of creative hardware. This stuff totally geeks me up. All this stuff, I spend, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, I spend 4 to 5 hours a day in VR if I can, just looking at new technologies, playing games, modeling, doing workflows. So in conclusion, what should you focus on if you're actually interested in UI? Don't stop doing that. Really, seriously, don't stop drawing, don't stop doing art. You want to be a UI artist? It's no excuse for you to be bad at art so that I'll just go into UI. It's more design heavy, it's not as much of a demand for doing art. I'm a pretty good graphic designer, therefore that's all I'm going to do. You can definitely get by and get a job in UI without being a really proficient illustrator, but I'll tell you, when I have a hard situation and I need to hand a job off to someone and that part requires illustration, and that job, if I gave it to someone who doesn't know how to do illustration and draw, that's now a 2-person job, because I have to have someone draw it and have that person design it. I'm always going to give it to the person who can draw, because it's a one-stop shop. Everything is inspiration. If you don't already think about your surroundings and the design of everything around you, start doing that. The chair you're sitting on, someone had to design that. The urinal in the bathroom, someone designed that. Someone designed how the piping and the ceramics and the way for it to eliminate odor. Those are all things people have to sit down and design and work on. Everything that you interact with, someone had to design. There had to be a manufacturing process to it. There had to be people who did patents on it. They had to figure out multiple different technologies and bring those together. Like the amount of things you have to know to build a television is incredible. From circuit boards to LCD display technology. Just use your brain in a way that kind of forces you to think about how things are created and made around you. Play games. I know this is not the hardest one up here, but definitely play them for fun, but also analyze them and look at them in a different way. If you're thinking about doing UI, start paying a little more attention to the UI. Start making notes of things you don't like in games. Start making notes of things you do like in games. Write it down if it helps you. This is one that actually I think a lot of people just don't like doing, but I definitely suggest to anyone, especially if they want to move into an art director role or a lead role later on. Learn the business you're in. Follow trends. Get involved in how game companies spend their money. Research distribution models. Go have lunch with unlikely people at the company you're at. If you have a business intelligence person at your company, go have lunch with them. Ask them questions about the business that you're in. It'll actually help you understand what you're supposed to do for the product better. So thanks, guys. That's it. Contact info here.